Today in this series on waggler fishing, I want to talk about casting. Casting is straightforward with a waggler. They're designed to cast, having plenty of weight at the base, either locking shot or a loaded waggler. They cast easily and well. To make casting easy for yourself, a nice easy action rod, which is why we call them waggler rods, is a help. Make sure you're not using too heavy a line. There are times if you're starting to fish some of the related methods like pellet waggler, you're going to be using 6 and 8 pound line, but for general float fishing for roach and skimmers, I use 2 pound Maxima, and it's important that the line is right up to the lip of the spool, that it's not just a half filled spool. And even with my Mitchell matches, which are very shallow spools, I did notice a month or so ago that the line on the reel was quite depleted. I changed it at Christmas, and although I hadn't fished many times, it had gone down quite a bit where I'd had 1 or 2 bad tangles. Probably had about 30 or 40 yards of line, and that was enough. When I was casting, you could hear a sort of swooshing noise. So if there's a swooshing noise, that's not very good. So they're the first big tips. Make sure you've got a light line, the reel is well filled, the rod is a nice easy action one. Stick float rods which have very tippy actions, a few of them are okay for some waggler fishing, but generally you want that more through action for a waggler rod and to make casting easy. And another important thing is that you've got enough weight on your waggler to cast the distance that you want, and a lot of people say that you should be able to overcast by sort of 20 or 30%. So if you're casting 15 yards, you really need enough to cast sort of 20 yards, enough weight to be able to cast 20 yards or even further. If you're really struggling to make the distance, the chances are the float's not taking enough weight. In this very first short clip that I'm going to add in here, you can see the distance between the float and the top ring when casting. If you wind a waggler right up to the top ring, or even have it just a foot or 2 away from the top ring, the rod can't get enough power into the rod. So when you're casting, you're winding power into the rod, so it's the power of the rod, not the power of your arm, and that's what makes it easy. So a very short distance, it just can't get it, but with it further away, it's got that pendulum effect and it casts much easier. And we're showing, I think I'm fishing about 8 or 9 foot deep here, and the float's around about a good 5 feet from the tip ring, and I would try and not go under about 4 foot. If you're metric, 1.2 meters, and more like 1.5 meters. So that's the first thing. And having cast out, and it's a nice easy action, as it comes down to land, and I'm trying to show this in slow motion more than once. It's what's known as feathering. In other words, you put your finger onto the line, onto the spool very gently, and this takes practice, so that it breaks the line, it breaks the float as it's coming into land, and that means that the float and the line below the float lands in a straight line. So you feather it down, and it's a matter of timing, so you get used to doing that through practice. And time again with waggler fishing, it's all about practice. Go out and practice a lot. So this feathering is very important, makes life easy. The general cast with a waggler is this straight overhead cast, but there are times when a little side cast, especially if you're not fishing too deep, is useful if you're underneath trees. I'm casting a light waggler sideways here, and it's fairly easy. It's not a way to get a lot of distance, but if you're not fishing very far out, it works well. Very deep water, you don't have to use a slider, and one way to cast when you're fishing very deep is to do what they call the roll cast, and I'm showing it here with fishing around about 14-15 foot deep. The float again is a good 4 foot from the tip of the rod. It needs a heavy float. This one takes 2.5 swan, and the last 4 or 5 foot of line, including the hook and the bait, is in the water just in front of me. What can go wrong here, and it did happen when I was filming it, is that little tiny rod grabbed the bait, and you go to cast and nothing happens. It just sticks and there's a little rod hanging on. But assuming that doesn't happen, it's very useful. On Breach Pond, where I did some of this filming, it is deep and there are often trees overhead, so the ability to cast from underneath trees with little roll casts in deep water is very useful. So you don't need that massive amount of room around you to cast properly. Again, it's worth practicing this. And the other thing you can do is to hold the hook length in your fingers, make sure you don't get hooked, just above the hook, and use that to keep the line straight and out of the way of the snags and trees, and to with a heavier float you can get that to fly out where you want it to. With a slider, much the same applies. Because you've condensed, although you might be fishing in 15 foot of water, because the float has come right down to the bulk shot or a small shot just above the bulk, the distance between the hook and the float is fairly small. It may be 5 or 6 feet, and so keeping that float well away from the tip ring, nice, again, this nice easy action we can see here, and again feathering it down and then making sure, don't try and sink the line straight away with a slider. You then watch that line shooting across the surface till it picks up the stop knot, hits the bottom ring of the float, and the float cocks up, and you're away basically. To summarise really with waggler fishing and casting, keep it simple, keep it smooth, practice, find a way of casting that is straightforward, try different methods with it, make sure your line's good, well filled reel, not too heavy a line. Certainly trying to fish light wagglers for roach and you've got 4-pound line on there, you're going to struggle. But I'll go the other way sometimes with very light floats with 1.5 pound Maxima, and believe me, it casts, it's so nice to fish with. Takes a delicate touch and plenty of experience and practice, but there you go. So keep trying different things with the waggler. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and please subscribe. I'll see you again soon.